Today on Rainbow Country, award-winning New York Times best-selling author Christopher Rice is my guest. And he's here today to talk about his latest gay romance novel, Sapphire Dawn, the fourth in a series of gay romance novels called Sapphire Cove. Now, you may be saying to yourself, Christopher Rice, is he related to the Anne Rice? Well, in a word, yes. Anne Rice is his mother. We'll talk about the Sapphire Cove series. We'll get his take on his mother's legacy, a globally known author who sold well over 100 million books worldwide. Plus, we'll find out just what he thinks of Interview with the Vampire.
Hi, I'm writer Adam Smith, author of Deep Sniff, A History of Poppers and Queer Futures. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
For the second time that evening, he was returning to his room, determined to focus on work, only to find himself Googling a porn star. Because he had more information to go on this time, the results came fast and furious compared to his last search. A quiet, nagging voice in his head told him this was a terrible idea, but a louder voice asserted it was exactly what he needed, to see the arrogant hormone tsunami crash against the rocks of a cheap porn set and its punishing hot lights, to see self-consciousness and awkwardness flit across his facial expression as he barked his way through a boring rotation of emotionless, badly scripted dirty talk. True, Richard had been using porn as his only sexual outlet since the divorce, but that didn't change the fact that most of it was incredibly stupid. Despite their spectacular bodies, the performers very often looked either uncomfortable or just bored, and he usually turned the volume off so he could imagine his own, more sophisticated or more forbidden setup and dialogue. All that said, it was probably wise to go for one of Bo Bonin's earlier works, to replace the confident sexual powerhouse of earlier with an awkward, fumbling young man who'd made questionable life choices. On one of his usual clip sites, he did a search for Bo Bonin and found a full-length movie from the mid-2000s that featured a younger, clean-shaven Donnie on its box cover. According to the synopsis and the punctuation-free customer reviews below, Seed billed itself as a parody of the 90s thriller Speed, only instead of featuring a bomb on a bus that would go off the second it dropped below a certain speed, this story involved a magical spell that would cause a man's giant dick to shrink if he didn't have sex every 3 hours. The well-endowed victim of said spell was played by none other than Bo Bonin.
Christopher Rice, hi, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
I am well. It's a pleasure to meet you. I am honored. Thank you for being here, to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for this, Mr. Christopher Rice. We're going to talk about legacy. We'll talk about vampires, but I want to start here with yourself. I want to start here. Are you a fan of sapphires?
Literally the stone. I don't know what they look like other than they're blue, right? My entire experience of sapphires with the color blue.
Okay. You have now a 4-novel story called the Sapphire Cove series. Sapphire
Yes.
Cove.
Yes.
Consisting of 4 books. The most recent one is out now, the 4th one, as of June 2024. These stories offer tales of passion, intrigue, steamy romance between men. This is a gay series. Well done. 2 books of yours came out in 2022. Sapphire Sunset, Second Chance Romance. Also in 2022, Sapphire Spring, Reformed Bully Romance. 2023, Sapphire Storm, Age Gap Romance. Enemies to lovers with a splash of taboo in there. I don't know what the taboo is.
A big splash, I'll tell you. Yeah.
And just released 2024's Sapphire Dawn, Opposites Attract Romance. 2 enemies have to plan a wedding together. So here's my first question for you. How are you feeling now that this four-book series is out to the world?
I didn't know if I'd ever write this series. I was driving my friends crazy talking about it. And it wasn't that I was talking about the idea of Sapphire Cove, which is a fictional resort on the Southern California coast. I was talking about the idea of doing a gay romance series. I'd written a lot of gay characters, I'd written a lot of thrillers with gay people at the center of them. I had never written stories about two boys just falling in love and living together happily ever after. And I had this experience of hearing that this genre had become a more commercially viable thing, kind of around the advent of digital publishing, having total contempt for it, dismissing it because most of the authors were allegedly women. And one night I got out of bed and I went to my computer and I logged on to Amazon and I just sort of plugged in gay romance, I think, to see what it threw back at me. And it threw two books back in particular that caught my attention. And I was so pretentious about it. I said, I'm going to one will clearly never satisfy me, so I'm going to read two at once. And I was totally swept away by them, totally, because I felt like I had walked into the gay cable TV network
Mm.
that had all gay programming on it. And I suddenly realized in the midst of reading these books, because I knew what the promise of a commercial romance novel was, which was a happily ever after, that these boys were not going to die. They were not going to kill themselves. They were not going to destroy each other. That this was a type of popular entertainment that I had never encountered. And what I subsequently discovered is that dismissive accusation that it was just straight women writing these books and fetishizing queer male bodies for an audience of other straight women is really not that accurate, that it was a very queer space from the get-go, because what was happening is that the authors in this genre were having to adopt these gender neutral pen names because they had to protect themselves from harassment at work, particularly if they worked in education. So of those two books I ordered, one author has since transitioned, and the other one I found out was living with her wife in the United Kingdom. So
Wow.
again, very queer from the get-go. But that was 10 years ago. I mean, I went 10 years writing romances about there. I wrote a bisexual one, but it had a straight woman very much at its center. I wasn't writing queer romances. And really what unleashed it was the pandemic. It gave me the time to begin pecking away at this idea in the afternoons and evenings when I would typically be leaving the house or going to the gym. So I didn't expect to be here to answer your question. I know that's a very long answer, but I also thought maybe three books, but I'm planning five. This is the second to last novel that I'm planning
Oh.
in the series. So I'm not done yet, and it's been a much longer road than I expected.
Mm. So 2024's Sapphire Dawn. Talk to me about
Right.
the story that you're telling within the pages of Sapphire Dawn.
I introduced a character in the very first book who was the best friend of one of the heroes. And the heroes in that book are pretty traditional. I mean, you've got a former Marine who's now a security director at a hotel falling in love with the scion of this wealthy hotel family. It's pretty traditional, but his best friend is a former gay porn star turned gay porn director who runs his own studio, who has absolutely no shame about his work. He's totally outspoken about it. He's totally self-possessed and self-confident, and he's a wonderful friend. And I knew that eventually I was going to tell his story. His name is Donnie. But I didn't know if his story was going to happen in the world of Sapphire Cove or if it was going to be some spin-off that would take us more into his professional life down in San Diego, which is about an hour's drive from where the resort is supposed to be, even though the resort doesn't exist. Um, so I waited a long time because I knew his story would be complicated. I knew that giving a happily ever after to an out and proud sex worker was going to take work. It was going to take work to invent the right partner for that person. And I kind of, I like to say the books all stand on their own because I'm a terrible series reader. Like I can't remember what happened in the previous book. So if you're going to bring something back, you need to reframe it, reintroduce it. And that's what I did here. But there, you do get to know Donnie some more in the previous book, where again, he is a good friend to one of the heroes. And his backstory, which is alluded to in that book, really gets explored in this one because that's kind of how I tell romance stories. My romances are if they have a formula, it's that the characters have something in their past that could they haven't really fully addressed yet. Maybe it's a blindness psychologically or an incorrect way of viewing something about their history, and they need to get over it to be with the one that they're meant to be with, and that's what happens here.
Mm. So my understanding is you know, a reader can just pick up one of these books, maybe the second one, the third one, this fourth one, and jump right into the story. They don't have to start
Yes.
from book one. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Like whether or not they will have a more enjoyable experience, I don't know. I can't say that for them, but structurally, they're designed to you can jump on at any point. You're really meeting these characters, the main characters, at this level for the first time in the series.
And you're writing this under a a pseudonym, a pen name,
Yes.
C. Travis Rice. Why the change?
Well, I would say it's an acknowledged pen name. And I think the reason for it was to be very clear with people who are fans of my previous books that you are getting something different. You
Mm,
right, if the pastel colors and the shirtless boys don't clue you in, that this is not going to be a story with demonically possessed plants or a face stealing serial killer or name the other dark things I've introduced in my thrillers over the years. And so I really did want to hang a lantern on that so that people didn't feel misled. And I think simultaneously keeping the Christopher Rice on the book cover and making it clear this is kind of an alter ego is about also saying there's no shame in writing something that's this gay and there's no shame in writing something that's romance. Two things that I also
mm,
thought were important.
mm. So, what would you say is the through line between these four novels that are out now? The commonality. Would you say that there is one?
Yes, I would. The thing that we say in the jacket copy, as they call it, is that this is about men releasing the shame that blocks their heart's desires, which is kind of romancy in tone, but it is about that. This is about these men are different flavors of queer,
Mm,
and they are all struggling with messages that they've received that flavor of queer is not deserving of a relationship or disqualifies them from a relationship. With Donnie, it is a difficult background as a sex worker, a difficult family background, his porn career, which is available to anybody who can search on Google, things that he's very proud of, but things which he has assumed because people have wrongly said to him mean you can't have a husband or there is no husband who is right for you. In the first book, Connor Harcourt, despite being a billionaire, is a very, very, very femmy boy. And he's been made to feel like that's the wrong kind of gay. His own family made him feel that way. And so when he falls in love with this very butch Marine, he deals with this terrible sense of inferiority that gets brought up by various things, which he has to work through. I think the one where it is the most clear is the second one, which is the most hard hitting one, the reformed bully storyline. I really get into what makes a bully and what it would mean to actually fall in love with later in life with a man who was really bad to you in high school. That's not, you don't just get over that in a conversation. And the third book is about a former escort who is basically one of the sons of his old clients targets him because he believes that he was actually his father's boyfriend and held a hand in destroying his marriage. And he goes to try to blackmail him, a plan which he fumbles terribly because he's very young and he's grieving his mother, and he ends up being sort of mentored by this man who sees the damage, who also says, look, I was not your father's boyfriend. I was an escort. I was being paid to provide a fantasy to him. I didn't know about his marriage. It wasn't my business to know about his marriage. So these are all really like the books may have blue and pink covers, but we're really dealing with some stuff in these novels. And I think these men are really wrestling. And like Donnie, Ethan, the character of that third book, the former escort, he deals with am I allowed to have this? Or has my past behavior disqualified me from love? I always think the answer to that question is no, but how these characters discover that is unique to their stories.
You were mentioning about this earlier, but was there a genesis? Was there a spark, a flashpoint that inspired you to tell these stories and these specific stories? Was there that moment for you that
Oh yeah. Yeah.
can you share that with us?
Well, I like to say I'm one of the many queer people that engaged in conversion media. I don't mean conversion therapy, but I grew up watching mainstream straight stuff and converting it to a queer couple in my head. And so a lot of the influences for this were not other gay romance novels, they were straight romance novels. And I went home to stay with my mother after a particularly difficult year professionally. And I needed a brain break. I just needed, it was Christmas and it was it was whatever. I needed to decompress, as they say. And I had these books on my e-reader that I had bought on sale from Nora Roberts, who's arguably the queen of the contemporary mainstream romance genre, and I think deservedly so. She's a very talented writer, doesn't get enough credit, I think, from the mainstream kind of literary establishment for what a good structuralist and character developer she is. And so it was a trilogy of novels set at this hotel in Northern California with these sisters, and I was just completely intoxicated by the world and the way these women showed up for each other and how they found love and the atmosphere of the setting, all this sort of stuff. And I said, I want to do a gay version of this. I remember I walked into the other room, Eric Shaw Quinn, my best friend and my podcasting co-host over at the dinnerpartyshow.com. He was there with me. He used to always come out and spend the holidays with us when my mother was alive. And he was he said, okay, he'd heard this before. I had been about to write a gay romance series for, I don't know, 10 years. But I said, I really feel like I've hit on something here. And then, as we were talking about earlier, the pandemic, that was December 2019. So I was doing that. And then I was going into my room and reading news articles about this little flu that was happening in China and thinking, oh, well, they'll clamp that down. I don't know. It'll be like the other false alarms. And then our lives became what our lives became globally. And I had the time to open up this book of notes I'd taken over the holidays and really start fleshing it out. And that's how it began. There were a few quotes from the industry trade publications of the day. Richard's favorite was, Bo Bonin shows affable charm and amazing power top skills as Gonna Bone You Reeves, a performance so hypnotic that you'll easily forget the actor bears little to no resemblance to the famous action star for which his character is named. The movie opened with the sounds of sex, but no visual sign of it, as a bejeweled fortune teller played by a drag queen who looked vaguely familiar announced to the camera that she was tired of being awakened by the constant rutting of her next-door neighbor and had decided to put a spell on him by way of her incredibly cheap-looking and fingerprint-spotted crystal ball. The next morning, she ran into a cheerful and whistling Bo Bonin in the hallway of their building and cackled out his punishment. Bo, looking leaner and more baby-faced than the Donnie of today, cried out in alarm and threw his hands over his crotch as if she'd kicked him there. The camera zoomed in on his wide-eyed silent scream that played like a close-up from a Hammer horror film. The fact that the fortune teller had attempted to cut down on her late-night disturbances by giving the horn dog next door even more reasons to have sex was not adequately explained, and Richard felt like a bit of a spoilsport for getting hung up on this detail. Maybe he should be more forgiving of porn plotting, but he'd never been a big fan of stories that involved magic in general. He much preferred historical fiction. If only Beau's oeuvre had included a smutty take on the life of artists in Belle Epoque Paris. The more salient point was that almost 15 minutes into this supposed gay porn classic, Richard was distracted, bored, and decidedly unaroused. Then Bo Bonin boarded a suspiciously empty city bus, save for one other male passenger, an absurdly pretty blonde who looked like a late 90s boy band member forced into a football jersey and tight jeans.
So, Christopher Rice, random
Yes.
question for you. Out of all the vampire characters out there in the world, do you have a favorite?
Oh, well, that's a hard one. Out of
I
all the
know.
vampire, are we disqualifying Anne
No,
Rice's vampires? Or are we including
no,
them?
no. Out of all of them, do you have a favorite?
I'm probably Team Marius. I'm probably
Oh,
Team Marius from the Vampire Chronicles. Is you know, there is a tortured soul to him, but he's also wise, and I think that the sentence that he sort of ends up with, being the keepers of those who must be kept, is both noble, but it's also really challenging. And I'm a big fan of him as a character.
is it fair to say that the inspiration for the vampire character Lestat was your dad, Stan Rice, a poet and painter, as well as your mom, Anne Rice. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say I think it's a question of proportion. I think she said frequently throughout her life that it was inspired by my father, and I think to a degree, I think that the Vampire Lestat of the novel The Vampire Lestat is more Anne than Stan. I think that the passion and the love with which Lestat beholds 1985 when he comes up out of the ground and sees its advancements over the 18th century and the centuries in which he really has lived mostly up until that point. That was all Anne. That was all Anne. The ability to see a timelessness in everything, that was all her. And that optimism that ultimately defines Lestat the rock star, Lestat the rebel, Lestat that's going to kick the vampire world in its teeth and make them all come out. That was all Anne. All Anne. You
Mm.
know, so I give her more credit for that character, I think, than she ever did.
Okay, so let's talk about legacy.
Mm,
In 1976, Anne Rice, your mother, uh, essentially gives birth to Interview with the Vampire, that is published in 1976. Her debut. In 1978, Anne Rice literally gives birth to Christopher Rice,
right.
and and here we are today. I believe over 100 million books sold worldwide. Uh, my understanding is that this all stems from a short story that your mom, Anne Rice, wrote back in, I believe, 1968. So, my question to you is that short story, has it ever seen the light of day?
That's a really good question. And I didn't have the date on that short story as being quite that far back. Um, that, I was familiar. She had written a novella called Catherine and Jean, which didn't have vampires in it, which was much more of it was a novella about two young people experiencing California, much in the same way that she and my father were. And I don't know where that is today. I don't actually know the status of the short story. I know that the novel was written in a white hot rush, and she wrote it without an elaborate publishing plan for it. She wrote it entirely on instinct and emotion, and she wrote it in a period of profound grief for my sister who died of cancer in 1975, I believe it was. I believe it was the year before Interview came out. It could have been 74. It was really a really dark time in their lives. And I think Interview with the Vampire, especially when you compare it to the later vampire novels, is much darker. It's much darker. And it's told through the point of view of this character, Louis, who is
Mm,
very much her. It's very
mm.
much her in that period in her life, but racked with guilt, wrestling with the loss of religious faith. All of that was very much her. And I remember well, we talked about this a lot when she was alive. She had really grand literary ambitions for it. She felt she'd written a very serious novel, but it didn't matter if the characters were vampires. They were talking
Mm.
about timeless themes, and it was a flop when it came out.
Originally, yeah.
Yeah, it was a flop, and there were things that happened before it was published that kind of generated a lot of publicity and a lot of heat, which was that, the movie rights were sold to Paramount Studios before the book ever came out. Um, the paperback rights were sold in advance and for a record that unseated the previous record holder, which was The Godfather by Mario Puzo. And everyone thought, oh, it's going to be hit. And then the New York Times hated it, and some other influential critics really hated it. And the paperback sold very poorly. And she would talk about the day they called to tell her that they were pulping it at the warehouse, basically destroying the physical copies of the book. And she became an author of historical fiction. She left vampires behind. She said, they're never gonna take what I'm doing with vampires seriously. The literary establishment isn't gonna respect this. And those were the days when it was basically enough for a book critic to compare your book to a comic book to kill it. You can't make that accusation today. Comic books and their fandom have become so evolved and so present in mainstream media that that's not enough of an insult. I mean, maybe somebody could make the case that this sounds too much like a Marvel movie and it shouldn't and wasn't marketed that way. Okay. But I don't think it would be quite the devastating blow that it was in 1976. And so she posted as recently on her Facebook page as I think it was 2014. She said it was a flop of a novel when it was first published. So she went on to write two historical novels, which were The Feast of All Saints, about the free people of color in Louisiana, and Cry to Heaven, which was a book about castrati, which many people, argue are two of her greatest books today. Also did not sell well, didn't meet the expectations of their publishers. But what began to happen, kind of in the shadows, if you were, is that people began to discover Interview with the Vampire. And it developed this growing, what they call a cult following, that by the mid 80s was no longer a cult following, it was a following. And it was significant enough for her to consider going back to that world and entering that world through a new point of view, which was the point of view of the vampire Lestat, who was largely a villain in Interview with the Vampire. He really is. We don't get it through his eyes. We get it through Louis's eyes. And I always tell the story of when, I'm a child in this period. I'm, is 7 or 8 years old. And she is a marginally well-known novelist. She's not anything like what she became a few short years later. And I believe it was a book event for the Vampire Lestat, but we were living in San Francisco still, and it was a wine and cheese kind of reception at an independent bookstore. Nothing like the marathon signing events that would follow shortly thereafter. And for the first time, people came in costume. Just a few of them. These beautiful men came dressed as Louis and Lestat.
Wow.
And I remember it was like the beginning of something. It was the sense that there was something on the wind. And then that book debuted at number 9 on the New York Times bestsellers list. And then I remember going to a signing down here in LA, where I now live, that had a line. And then things started to roll. And it was all really began with it really began with Interview with the Vampire. And the reason I always tell that story, I think it's important for artists and creators to hear it, because the life of your work is not determined by the initial response to it. Many things have flopped right out of the gate, but if it's out there and people can find it, there's no telling where it may eventually end up in the culture.
Well said. Well said. Okay. 2017. Here's part of a quote of yours. Quote, "The first great day for me on this project was when my mother asked me to partner with her on it. The second is the announcement of this thrilling partnership with Paramount Television and Anonymous Content," unquote. So you and your mother are both executive producers on the new AMC series Interview with the Vampire. How involved are you with that show, with AMC?
I have no comment and must refer all inquiries to AMC.
It's just us gays.
Yeah,
No
I can
comment
talk
still?
No comment.
Have you seen it at all?
No comment.
I think that says it all. Okay, so let's move on.
Great.
Are you you're on record saying that The Mayfair Witches is one of your, if not the favorite book from your mom, of your mom.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
What is it about that book, Mayfair Witches, that is your favorite compared to like something from the Vampire Chronicles, let's say?
Well, I was present for that book. That book,
Mm.
the Mayfair books are about a house that I grew up in. And they're really about Anne's return to New Orleans as a grown woman. She left against her will when she was 14 years old, and her mother died, and her father remarried, and they moved to Texas, where she eventually met my father, and they fell in love. But she didn't want to leave New Orleans as a child, and she had terrible grief for the city, which was also tied up in her grief for her mother. So she was uh, full of a desire to return, and it sort of pours through the pages of that book. And I was there. Like, that's really the short answer. I was there. I met all those cousins. I met all the cousins who were inspirations for it. I remember when the house was a wreck when we first moved into it, and we started. Oh, and I didn't want to live in that house. I did not want to live in that house. It was between that house and a really beautiful, recently redone similar house that was in a much more uptown neighborhood in New Orleans. And the First Street house was supposedly haunted, and it had been repossessed from a savings and loan family that had gone out, that had been arrested. The husband had been arrested. It was falling down. There was a caretaker living in it who was so afraid to be there alone, he slept with a gun. Like, everything about that house felt like wrong to me. But she rehabilitated that house. She turned it into the house of her dreams. And that's so what those books are about, you know? And the interesting thing about The Witching Hour, the novel, is that she tried to make it work over and over again when we lived in San Francisco, and she couldn't crack it. She couldn't crack it, and there was no Michael Curry, and that was the problem. Is that the book needed Michael Curry for her. That she had a witch named Catherine who was sort of playing the Michael Curry role, and it wasn't coming together. And when she built that relationship between Michael and Rowan, um, the thing took off. But the other thing is she moved to New Orleans. And I think when she reconnected with that city, that's when the book exploded. And so, yeah, it is really I don't know if it's my favorite of all of her novels, but it's really close to the top because of the world of it.
When you were now getting into writing and seriously getting into writing, considering being an author, were you hesitant at all because of the bigness of your mother and her career? Did
I
that
I
influence you at all?
it did influence me. I will say this: like, I had ways around it in my head, as illogical as they were. Initially, I didn't think I would write novels. I thought I would be a dramatic writer. I thought I would be screenplays and plays because I was really a theater kid, and I had gone off to college with big acting ambitions that were not shared by my theater department in college. And when I went a year without even being called back, I was devastated, and I started writing. But I really didn't think I would write prose. And in my head, I'm like, that's her thing. I'll do something else. And then when I did finally break down and turn a short story into a novel, kind of on a whim, I never thought I'd do anything supernatural. That was my other thing. And I went a long time not doing anything supernatural. It was 2014, I think, when I wrote The Heavens Rise, which was my first really supernatural thriller. And I took a long time with it. I took a long time. I didn't sign a contract for anything. I wanted to try different things. I wanted to rewrite it. I wanted to get feedback before a publisher ever saw it. And that opened a door. But I think giving myself those kind of, I don't know, they were mental tricks, is really what they were, helped me. But I think starting with were arguably just contemporary thrillers, not historical, not paranormal, and disappointing to a lot of Anne Rice fans because I guess they had some expectation that her son would write exactly like she did, and
Mm,
I didn't. But I think that helped me psychologically in the beginning.
mm. So here's my last question for you, Christopher. You've published well over 20 novels, I believe. You're an award-winning, best-selling New York Times author. What do you hope your audiences come away with after they've experienced Christopher Rice?
The thing that I think is the most important about any satisfying work of entertainment or popular fiction is catharsis. It is a sense of having expunged negative emotions, and you feel a sense of relief and exhaustion at the end. I think that's how I feel satisfied. I'm both relieved and exhausted that I read the thing that I read. I hope that's an experience I can deliver to some readers. But the thing that is the most important to me personally, and I don't know if this is something other people get out of it, is I did want to see gay boys doing things in stories that we didn't usually see them doing. I wanted to see them saving the world. I wanted to see them getting married to their boyfriend on the beach. I wanted to see all these things that, most of the gay books that I encountered when I came out, which were absolutely necessary and essential, and I'm not begrudging them, there were really grim, politically urgent processings of the AIDS epidemic, because that was the period when I was coming out. 1996 was the first year protease inhibitors hit the market and changed outcomes. So I was marinating in a lot of really grief-filled work. And a lot of it was wonderful. Dancer from the Dance, like People from History by Felice Picano, wonderful novels, formative novels for me. But I was hungry for something different. And so I hope I've delivered that.
Hmm. Christopher Rice, well said, well done, well written. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. As Bo Bonin walked past him, the boy gave him a look that was supposed to appear lascivious, but made him look sleepy and confused. When Bo Bonin smiled at the passenger, suddenly it was Donnie's smile filling Richard's suite. The same smile that had done a number on Richard's insides several times that evening. Utterly convincing, and a warning. This was a mistake, a big one. He'd wanted to see Donnie's confident swagger ironed out of him by what he imagined was a cold and emotionless process at heart, having sex on camera. He should close his laptop now and walk away. But he didn't. And when the bus passenger sank to his knees and fished Donnie's, Jesus H. Christ, that thing should have its own zip code, cock out of his jeans, Donnie's eyes hooded with what looked like genuine desire, and he began caressing the guy's hair with a convincing mix of tenderness and force. And when he took the twink's turgid cock into his mouth like it was a long-delayed meal, it was as if the bus around them and whatever camera crew they jammed onto it had faded from his world, and there was only pleasure, the giving of it, the receiving of it, the performing of it. If it was a performance, it was a damn good one. And by the time Bo Bonin was claiming his jersey-clad admirer doggy style over the back row of seats, Richard's hand had floated down to his own crotch, and he found himself digging his own cock from his slacks. The dirty talk, which Richard had expected to sound stilted and silly, throbbed with conviction.